My name is Courtney. I am the Exhibits and Programs Coordinator for the Orange County Historical Museum, and we are absolutely thrilled that y'all are here today. And before we get started, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about what is kind of a crazy story for how we wound up here today. So in one of my duties with the museum, I have been writing a series of children's books that are set in Orange County to teach children about what the county was like. And the idea was for them to learn about different sections of the county, different decades in the 20th century, through the stories and the adventures of dogs. So for each decade of the 20th century, I chose a different breed and a different community to focus on. So I was writing the book for Chapel Hill, which takes place in 1915, and I came up with the story about a Boston Terrier, because that was the most popular breed at the time. Wrote the story, but I needed a name for the owner of the dog. So I wanted something that was period appropriate. So pull out, it's set in 1915, pull out the 1915 Yakety Yak UNC yearbook, and I'm looking through. I was going to take one first name and match it with another last name and just create a fictitious character. Lo and behold, I came across Preston Epps, and he matched perfectly the character that I had created because the character was in the Glee Club. So I really wanted to use the real name and not use a fictitious one. So that meant I had to get permission, which meant then digging deep into the internet and spying and doing all of that kind of work. So was able then, through my searching, to find someone in the family with a public email, and that would be Reverend Joe Mitchell back then. So I sent him an email, contacted him, and he said, I think the person you need to talk to is my father, Preston Mitchell. So I had a wonderful conversation with Mr. Mitchell, in which he said that his grandfather would have been delighted. He never owned a Boston Terrier, but he had dogs, and he'd be very pleased to have his name and likeness be used in the book. And he said, and by the way, I wrote a biography of my grandfather. I'll send you a copy. So I read the biography, and the story just got better and better and better. So we invited Mr. Mitchell to come here today to talk to you about his absolutely incredible grandfather, his life story, as well as his life lessons. And I wanted to say one more thing about the book. It is set here in Chapel Hill. It is published by our friends at the Chapel Hill Historical Society. And because we wanted to connect it to Chapel Hill, actually got a student to do the wonderful illustrations that you will see in the book. And is Maddie here? There you are. It's you, but I only met you once. So this is Maddie Stratton. She is the incredible illustrator for the book, and art is just a hobby for her. She's quite a remarkable young lady. So she did beautiful drawings and turn the floor.
Hello, everybody. My name is Katie Atkinson. I'm the site manager at the Orange County Historical Museum, and as it happens, an alum of the UNC Classics Department. So it's a wonderful connection that we have between our two organizations. So I would like to take some time to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Mr. Preston Mitchell. Preston Mitchell spent 39 years in education and 25 years coaching basketball. He was ordained as a minister in the Episcopal Church in 2013. And a major part of his work with the church was establishing the beloved community, dealing with racial reconciliation. He is the author of A History of All Saints Episcopal Church, The First 100 Years, Chase the Buffalo, a 25-year odyssey of discovery and awareness, and Preston H. Epps, a North Carolina classic. He has also cycled 11,000 plus miles across the country in a continuous loop through all lower 48 states, which is really awesome. So please join me in welcoming Preston Mitchell.
Thank you. It's a good afternoon to everybody. The aim of education is to make people better than by nature are. This modest, simplistic restatement from Aristophanes' Frogs was the basis for how Preston Herschel Epps sought to guide his students for nearly half of a century. Dean Rusk was probably the most famous person that Granddaddy taught, and I might say that they remain friends right to Granddaddy's end. In fact, Dean Rusk called him the most influential man in his life in his biography. But he also such names as Kendrick Pritchett, who was University of California professor emeritus of Greek, Harmon Caldwell, who was the dean of University of Georgia Law School, Andy Griffith, some guy was on TV, Denton Lotz, who actually Denton Lotz died the day before we released this book. We had a lot of conversations, but he was the president of the Baptist Worldwide Missions. Jack Spong, who was the Episcopal Bishop of Newark, who was very much in the forefront of the LGBT issues in the Episcopal Church, dating all the way back to the 1970s. And John Wofford, who was the head of the religious department at Wofford College. These are folks that I had the opportunity to talk with, to write with, everybody except Andy Griffith. And unfortunately, three of those men died within the year. He was known as Dr. Epps. He didn't refer to himself as that. Professor Epps. I call him Granddaddy, but I'm going to use Preston as I talk about him today. Okay, let's see. How do I get this?
Press the forward arrow.
Okay. I don't know. Somebody tell me, is this in Murphey Hall where he's teaching right here? Does anybody know? Very daunting to be here at Murphey Hall. And one of the things I found out when I was going over everything, as much as I edited and looked at this book, I misspelled Murphy. I didn't know that until I got this invitation. So, oh, man, it's got me into it. So, anyhow, this is Preston teaching somewhere. You can see he lived a long life. He was 94 when he died. And so I got to know him, not just as Granddaddy as a young kid, but also as I embarked on my own professional life. So that was very, very good, very neat. Much of what I'm going to talk about, I wrote in a book 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, right here. And I do have copies if people would like to purchase them afterwards. And it's simply about his life. When he died, my mother ended up with all of his stuff, papers, letters, all kinds of things. It's a trunk full of stuff down in the basement. And oftentimes she said, I just need to get rid of that stuff. I said, no, don't get rid of it. Don't get rid of it. Because I did have in the back of my mind, I wanted to write about him. And not so much because all 7 of his grandchildren were still living, but for those that when we were gone would know him. And so it was a family matter for me. When I retired from teaching in 2014 after 39 years. And so I had some time to do some writing. I wrote about my bicycle adventures, and I wrote about, started writing about Granddaddy. And so I would take all of this stuff and I would sort it out. I spent so much time sorting and resorting and reading and putting together in folders how I would chronologically assemble this book. I decided early in the process that I'd self-publish because I didn't think I had the credentials. Well, I know I don't have the credentials or the connections to a publishing house or anything like that. And again, I wanted it really to be something that, you know, really be left for the family and those interested. And I had already had a couple of books printed and a local publisher in Johnson City, Tennessee, and so I used that. But I appreciate the classics department for being in this space. It's very daunting. Though my grandfather's office was in Murphy 104, and so we're pretty close. And also for their support, I came down on an occasion and met with Professor Reeves and went through the archives here in preparation for this. And also I'd like to thank the Orange County Historical Society that arranged this. Very much appreciate Courtney and Katie for arranging this opportunity. He was born on April 26, 1888, somewhere he thought, in Pennsylvania County, just over the North Carolina line, and that's all I knew about his birth. All that he cared to write in a very short autobiography. He spent 2 pages talking about the first 20 years of his life. And my mother did not elaborate on his early life, saying simply that Daddy did not think that sort of thing was important. However, I thought, well, if I'm going to write a biography, I got to know where it started. And so I began to dig. Coming through the census records, I found that his mother, Tabitha Epps, was born in Halifax County, Virginia in 1869. And from there, the dominoes began to fall as I learned that her father, Daniel, was born in 1838. Daniel and his wife, Jenny, had 3 children, Martha, Joseph, and Tabitha. And all of them are listed as mulatto in the census of 1870. So, I didn't know anything about, I didn't really know a whole lot about genealogy. I knew what the word mulatto was mixed race. And so I again began to dig more. 1880, they're all listed as mulattoes. Martha has children, they're listed as mulatto. And so I went to Halifax County Courthouse and went to Person County Courthouse, and I found out this high plains of the Piedmont was an area where people who identified as Sappony. I've got a Sappony cousin here today, Sheila Martin. And I said, I wanted to find out more about Sappony. Actually, I got greater part of the information on the Sappony that I got, other than the very little bit that's actually published or you can find on the internet, was a Professor G.K. Waldrop. He has a PhD in history from Duke, and he teaches English at Bucknell University. And we started corresponding. He spent 20 years studying the diaspora of the Sappony people that in large part happened around the turn of the 20th century. And he knew Preston H. He knew exactly who my grandfather was. He knew a lot of the Eppses and Martins and Stewarts and Tallies and Shepherds and Gordons and which one am I missing, Sheila?
Coleman's and Tallies.
Coleman's and Tallies, I thought that, yeah, Coleman's and Tallies. The 7 core families that make up the Sappony people. He never talked about that. He was, he doesn't remember his father. And his only sibling, Janella, died when she was 19 years old in Bulls Gap, Tennessee. Daniel Epps, his grandfather, he said, served as his father. He was born in 1838. Preston describes him as a kind but illiterate man. Daniel and his wife, Jenny Jones, are buried in the Maplewood Cemetery in Durham. But there is no census, as you all know, of 1890. It burned up in a fire, so we don't know exactly that part. But in 1900, they appear in Durham. And no longer are they mulatto, they're white. There's a whole lot of digging and backstory on that and the Sappony that left the high plains during that time. Clark Hines, who actually I got a text from today, he probably said he was going to be here. He said he was going to register. Clark Hines is a cousin of mine, a fourth cousin. We share a great-great-great-grandfather, but Clark Hines and his family identify as African American. And Professor Waldrop said those that left the High Plains either identified as white or identified as African American. He said it's about an equal number. Clark Hines, incidentally, I always throw this in there because I'm a coach. He's the all-time leading receiver for Duke University. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame and played for the Buffalo Bills. And he was at our releasing of the book, Clarkston Hines was, as well as his son Clark. So that's a really interesting the whole Sappony picture. The Sappony are recognized by the states of North Carolina and Virginia as a state recognized native tribe, do not recognized by the federal government. I want to say one other thing about the Sappony. That may come up. In 1898, Martha, let me say one more thing about Martha, and I'll move on off the Sappony. But Martha is the oldest of Daniel's children, okay? She's Tabitha's older sister. When the Civil War ended, as many of you know, in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau came to the South and established schools. And in those schools, for a short period of time, Black and white children went to school together. I was able to get a copy of the Person County Freedmen's Bureau school that listed the children, but whether they went to school together, they listed the children by their colored parents and their white parents, terminology. Yeah. And under the colored parents, Martha Epps and Daniel. Again, the evidence of them being from a mulatto family, him being from a mulatto family. In the census of 2 years later, in 1898, Lucius, who was Martha's child that she had out of wedlock, and Martha ended up marrying a man named Owens and moved to Richmond, Virginia, where she died. And Lucius took his 4 half siblings, he's 20 years old, and moved them to Selma, North Carolina, where he'd gotten a job with the railroad. Okay. And so Daniel, Lucius's grandfather, Daniel and Jenny, Lucius and his 4 half siblings live in Selma. Tabitha, Preston, and Janella stayed in what my grandfather described as the one-room shack where you could see the stars when you lay down at the bed. All 3 of them shared in what he described as abject poverty for a year and a half. Now, where that was, because they moved to, in my assumption, and it's only that, is they moved back to the High Plains from where they were from. And but in 1900, they moved to Selma, and then later in that same year, they moved to Durham in 1900. And it's in the census of 1900 that we find the Epps family listed as white. And Preston, as a 12-year-old, went to work. He had had 3 months of schooling in Selma, the only 3 months of formal schooling he had. And then he went to Durham and went to work. When he was 14, his mother died. 5 years later, his grandmother died. And when he was 21, his sister died. He was left just him and his grandfather. And it was the fall of 1909. And his words always was, I see my grandfather on a train to Oklahoma to be with his son, Joseph. That's the last that he ever spoke about his grandfather. And in that fall of 1900, fall of 1909, he went to school. He's 21 years old. He'd been going to the Second Baptist Church in Durham, where he sang in the choir. He loved to sing. Apparently he had a pretty good voice. And the minister, Reverend Barrett, took him to the Durham County superintendent of schools said, give this boy a chance. Give this boy a chance. He's 21 years old, 7th grade, on a trial basis. 3 years later, he graduated from high school. Not only that, this is what I find even more amazing. He was elected president of the senior class. This 24-year-old, can y'all imagine? This 24-year-old dude as the president of the class. What they did. He went to University of North Carolina on a scholarship. He stayed at the Crabtree boarding house on Vickers Road. I didn't know where Vickers Road was, and I looked it up, and we passed it coming in, driving in today. It's about 6 miles from campus or something like that. He had a motorcycle because he kept it. He never had a car until he was 60 years old, but he had a motorcycle, and he used that motorcycle to get to campus here. And he also used the motorcycle because he kept his job directing the choir at the Second Baptist Church, for which he was paid $35 a week. In 3 years, he graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1915 with a major in English and a minor in Greek. And the next year, 1916, he graduated with a master's in English and also a bride. I got it. I left that. I'm the slides it out of order. Should have prepared better. Anyhow, he was in 1915, in the end of the school year, towards the end of the school year, this Reverend Barrett asked him to accompany him on a revival in Georgia. And so he said he cleared it with his professors, and he calls up with a fistful of books. He left to go on this revival. And while they were in Newton, Georgia, the jeweler in town, Mr. Banta, said, I've got a young lady I'd like for you to meet if you don't take her away. And to which, this is his words, he says, well, if she's pretty nice, I just might do that. One of the things I can't envision my grandfather, but apparently as I kind of trekked through this, he was kind of a player. He always kind of had a girlfriend who's in school and, you know, years in his college years. Well, sure enough, on the next Saturday night, she promised to wait on him for the next year. And sure enough, the next summer, he came back and married her. And that's Stella picture and the 3 daughters they had. Aida's the oldest, and Barbara and Holding, my mother, baby Marge. Now let's see if I can find the slide I want. Yeah, there it is. 1916. In 1916, they moved to Atlanta. He accepted a job teaching English, Latin, and 1 course in Greek at Boys High in Atlanta. I'll read to you what he said about Boys High. For 12 years, I taught Greek in high school in Atlanta, and they had the most wonderful system down there. I wish the education people had never persuaded them to destroy it. They had 4 high schools, a commercial high school for people going into commercial work, and a tech high for people who were going to learn to do things with their hands training. Hands training, I always called it. But I never thought there was anything inferior about it. If I were a plumber, I'd be proud of it. If I were a good audible plumber, there's no difference between a college professor and a plumber. They're just different fields. So many people think working with your hands is inferior until the electricity goes off, and then look where you are. He was at Boys High from 1916 to 1928. And there's, in his very first Greek class was Harmon Caldwell, who I mentioned, who became the dean of the law school at the University of Georgia. And Kendrick Pritchett, also professor emeritus of Greek at California, and Dean Rusk, of course, who was the 2nd longest serving Secretary of State in our country's history. Now, while he only taught 1 course in Greek, he only had 4 students in the whole school that took it. They said then that the Greek was just a course that being phased out. Good at the classic department. But it was his love of Greek, the language and its people were his passion. As he explained it, it came from his desire to know exactly what those New Testament writers were saying. Singing in various denominational churches and at various revivals, he noticed that the preachers interpreted the Gospels in different fashion. In the interview with the Chapel Hill Weekly in 1962, he explained, so after a while I said to myself, now look here, the text, passage from Scripture, must have said something. It can't say three different things. So I decided I better learn me some Greek. I took 2 years of Greek in high school, then I came over here to Carolina and studied it. While there were only 4 students enrolled in Greek that first year, when he left in 1928, there were 60 boys enrolled in various Greek courses. Come on in. He left boys' home after completing work in his PhD in Greek from the University of Chicago. It took 4 summers of coursework and then a year without pay to stay on campus in Chicago. He even told the story that he paid $75 for a train ticket to go from Durham to Chicago to sit for a 30-minute exam. Imagine doing that. He also claimed the expense of getting that took him 20 years to get out from under the hole. His dissertation was on the place of Sparta in Greek history and civilization. 5 years later, while teaching at Furman, the Classical Philology published a chapter of his work. The Chicago Daily News, in its February 15, 1933 edition, had the headline, Spartans brave? Forget it. Howard State University of Chicago professor. The conventional name for the headline did not really capture Preston's argument, which was that Spartan valor was not a natural outgrowth of an inborn quality, but rather attained because of the fear of failure that was instilled at an early age. Paul Shorey, his professor at the university, wrote to him this note. You'll be much amused to learn that your article on Sparta has fluttered the dovecotes more than any paper in classical philology for a long time. Modern Greeks are up in arms. Letters to my research assistant, Mr. Costa, who is himself a Spartan, and asking him to do something about it. Now, given his own ethnicity and how little he knew or perhaps cared about that sort of thing, it's not surprising that Preston thought any bravery ascribed to the Spartans was a result of training, not any type of inborn quality. His writings were during a time when not only Nazi Germany, but also much of the United States academic world was enamored with eugenics, ascribing certain traits to one's genetic makeup. Note in Shorey's message that his own assistant claimed to be a Spartan. In 1928, with his PhD, with his terminal degree, he went to Furman University and moved the $3 to Greenville, where they taught him what he considered then to be a very rigid Baptist university. He said this. In 1932, charges of heresy were brought against Preston for a casual remark he had made in class, saying he was not, quote, trusting any blood of Jesus to save me, but rather in a living relationship with Jesus himself. The remark was seen as challenging atonement theology, which many Southern Baptists felt was a cornerstone of their faith. A student reported the remark to a pastor at the Baptist church, and together they went to the school authorities. A special board of trustees meeting was called to hear the charges. Preston was able to successfully defend himself from the charges, which were ultimately dismissed. Nevertheless, the restraint of academic freedom certainly grated on his mind. Despite that, he remained a Baptist all of his life, and claiming that those at Furman thought him too liberal a Christian, while at Carolina years later they thought his theology too conservative. In spite of some of these problems, he claimed he had splendid students at Furman and enjoyed his relationship with colleagues. Just as at Boys High, interest in the Greek followed him. When he arrived in 1928, there were only 6 students taking the Greek. When he left, 25 students were enrolled. And I might also, as an addendum, my nephew, Nate Mitchell, is a Furman graduate. He came to university, back to the University of North Carolina in 1938. I meant to say something when he came in 1915 to show, how all these institutions have grown. In the spring of 1915, University of North Carolina graduated 100 students.
Wow.
Quite a different place, huh? Returning home as an associate professor in the classics in the fall of 1938, the family rented a house at 223 Rosemary Street, which was home for the next 32 years. I think it's a frat house, last I looked at it. The house was a 10-minute walk from his office in Murphey Hall, which he made each morning, back for lunch and his 20-minute nap before returning in the afternoon for his office hours. He did not own a car until 1947, just shy of his 60th birthday. His course load entailed 15 hours a quarter. Carolina did not go on the semester system until sometime in the 1950s. But his courses were varied, from biblical history to New Testament Greek to Greek tragedy and Roman comedy. 2 years into his teaching, the student newspaper published his 10 teaching facts of life. 1, the quality of thoughts one gives assent to in his heart of hearts determines the type of person one will become. 2, whatsoever a man sows as to his character, that shall he also reap as to his character. 3, low and mean conduct always began in the doer some greater capacity of low and mean conduct. 4, charitable and creative goodwill always beget in the doer some greater capacity for charitable and creative goodwill. 5, hatred in the end is always divisive and disintegrating force. 6, charitable and creative goodwill in the end are always unifying, integrating forces. 7, retaliation is always inferior to motive and in quality of results to a settlement on the level of grace. 8, compromise with one's best self for the sake of material or social gain is always debilitating to character. 9, willful subjection of one's will and emotional self to the will and governance of one higher and nobler than himself. Always raises one's self and conduct. And 10, as one continues to act, so he becomes. In 1942, he was promoted to full professor, published his first book, a translation of Aristotle's Poetics. And 6 years later, he helped revise the late G.S. Hera and George Howe's Greek literature and translation, including in that text was Preston's translations of Aeschylus' Agamemnon, Plato's Crito, and several shorter selections. In 1954, I've already mentioned Denton Lotz, who was the secretary of the Baptist World Alliance, John Wolford, chair of the religion department, Jack Spong, Episcopal Bishop of Newark, were all students in his Greek classes. And I had the opportunity to correspond with all 3 of those men, and all 3 of them are now deceased. So I barely got under the deadline of getting some of his former students. And of course, his most famous student, at least when I was teaching in high school, was Andy Griffith. And I said that as one student said, well, did he teach Barney Fife? Anyhow, in 1995, Bill Friday, who was president emeritus of the University of North Carolina, and he was doing TV shows on public television, had Andy Griffith on, and in the last 5 minutes, he said, I'm going to let you just say something about the university. We're celebrating our, I think it was then the 200th anniversary. And so he said, did you have a favorite professor, or were they all your favorite? Griffith. The first name that jumped to my mind will be a name you might not have imagined. But when you said that, the first name that came to mind was Dr. Preston Epps. Friday, what a man. Griffith taught the Greek. And I, as a pre-ministerial student, had to take Greek. But when I first went, I could not memorize the alphabet. I went to Dr. Epps. I told him I was a self-help student. I can't learn this. He said, you're worthless. That's what you are. And I took the course next year, and I passed. He was the choir master at the Methodist Church. And he was Baptist, but he hired me as his baritone soloist and gave me $5 a Sunday each time I sang. He was, of all the people, he was the favorite. Friday. Dr. Epps was truly a great fellow in a lot of ways. Griffith, oh, I know he was. He was, if we might say it on television, a Christian, a wonderful man, a kind man. Friday. But he could look you in the eye and tell you if you weren't performing, oh, yes, sir, in a minute. That's good teaching. 1954, Preston was among 6 professors to have the Yakety Yak dedicated. The next year, he was awarded the highest professional honors at the university when he was named Keenan Professor. And in the biography that's written in the book, it says this. Although Epps was responsible for these and other publications that have been listed, publishing was never a major purpose of his studies and research. His major interest was always to help and encourage students toward a clear and intelligent understanding. An understanding of themselves and the world they were to live in, of their potential power to become either persons of integrity, goodness, and nobility, or embodiments of evil, meanness, and the ignoble. And to help them become incurably persuaded to live their lives at all costs on the basis of their best selves. I recently read that since 2008, students have turned away from the humanities, preferring to major in fields that offer more certain and lucrative employment. That's not anything new. In 1953, in addressing his first class in Greek tragedy 153, the university in that year, they went into classes and they filmed certain classes, I guess, some kind of promotional tool or recruiting tool or something like that. So they chose his Greek 153 tragedy, first Greek tragedy. It was the first day of class. And he says, if you were looking for a course to help you get on in the world or accumulate wealth, though these are both honorable objectives, you will get very little from this course. Rather, humanity courses are to help you to become the most humane, intelligent, and decent person you can possibly be, and live your life on that basis. I think that he felt that human beings were born with a blank slate and possessed the potential for both good and evil. And he did use the word evil. Which path one chooses depends on their choice. And that's very much a humanist thinking. But the path that Preston chose very early in life was to follow a man that he always referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. He was baptized at 15 years of age, Second Baptist Church. He believed that Jesus of Nazareth came into the world primarily for two purposes. One, to redeem humankind from their self-centered selves back to their God and to their neighbor. And two, to initiate among those who chose to follow him a new approach to living with their neighbor. Up here and now. And Jesus referred to this approach to living together as the kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven, as Matthew's gospel speaks to it. He wrote extensively on what he thought the scriptures spoke to this spirit, the spirit of the kingdom. And he often referenced John's verse saying that God is spirit, and those that worship God worship in spirit. He once told me that he taught Sunday school class in the Gospels for 40 years. 40 consecutive years he taught Sunday school, taught the Gospels. And each year there was something new that he learned. He wrote not only to publish things, he wrote things just for himself. He wrote a bound 240-page typewritten booklet called One Layman's Faith. Not for publication, just what he believed in 240 pages. Now, you got to understand, Preston Epps could be verbose. My mother claimed that. I'm not sure which of the courses was his favorite to teach, but I would think that any course involving the tragic poets would rank very high. The poets are referenced a good deal in his Thoughts from the Greeks, which was a book that was published in 1970 when he was 82 years old. And in 1954, in the University of North Carolina Extension Bulletin, Preston wrote an article entitled Understanding Greek Tragedy. And this may be the most lengthy thing I've read, so you can tune it out if you're not into Greek tragedy. But in it, when he talked about Greek tragedy, he said that one must understand four indispensables to understanding them. The first deals with the fact that only a small percentage of the Athenian plays, 33 of the approximate 300, written by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, not to mention the other tragic writers, only 300 have survived. Therefore, our knowledge of Athenian tragedy remains limited. Rather than say Aeschylus would never say this or that, we should say on the basis of what has survived of Athenian tragedy, such and such seems to be true. The second indispensable is that from the time of Homer through the 5th century BCE, Athenians accorded their poets the first place in their scheme of education and demanded that they be teachers of the good and useful. Thus, these plays were written and learned not for entertainment value. Indeed, that was of little importance. Few things are better documented in surviving Athenian thought than this teaching function demanded of the tragic writers. This view of tragic writers held true at least until the time of Plato's writings around 400 BCE. In his 10th book of the Republic, Plato questions the exalted place that Homer occupied in Athenian society. For Plato, reason was man's ultimate goal, and feelings and emotions transmuted by the poets only clouded man's efforts to master his intellect. Well, isn't that the truth even today? Conflict between emotions and reason. Philosophy was at war with poetry in general and tragedy in particular. Thus, Plato felt compelled to banish poets from his state, which was to be ruled by philosophy and philosophers. Yet Plato's war only served to emphasize the role of the poets as the supreme teachers among the Greeks of his time. The third indispensable for understanding Greek tragedy is to understand the role of omens and oracles in Greek life in general and in Athenian tragedy in particular. Many of the tragedies involved in one way or another with an oracle or the will of gods in the fate of people's lives. The question is just how much did these 5th century Greeks hold their gods accountable for events in their lives? Whereas the Homeric epics describe these omens and oracles and put much stock in their participation in people's lives, by the 5th century, These oracles were much criticized by the Greeks themselves. Our own 20th century conception of God has been molded by the Hebrew deity and perfect rightness of such a monotheistic God that we can, quote, easily slip into the belief that the Greeks had much the same feelings toward their gods and demands of their gods. This statement seems to be contrary to the fact. By the 5th century, Athenians did not think that the gods' commands should always be obeyed. If they were reasonable and just, then they were to be obeyed. If not, then they were not obeyed. And the final indispensable regarding understanding Greek tragedy is the role of fate, which presents the most difficult problem in the understanding the mindset of the tragic poets. It is as much a problem for people today as it was 2,500 years ago. Democritus wrote at that time, men fashioned for themselves a thing called chance as an excuse for their witlessness and lack of judgment. Thus, what people call fate is a rationalization to excuse acts of passion, stupidity, or ignorance. Preston grew up in the Jim Crow South, a race-based society that, whether he was aware of his own mulatto free person of color, what we consider Sappony today, were treated just as unjustly as Black Americans. I know I went and spoke to Chief Otis, and he talks about his little boy. He couldn't go to the drugstore there in South Boston to get a soda or something to eat. And schools were segregated, and Sappony had their own school. And just a side note of that, my Preston's uncle, Epps, his land was donated to build the first High Plains school. Dideron's death certificate lists his race on his death certificate is Croatan Indian. Y'all know the story. The Croatan were the Indians of the lost colony of Roanoke. So the Croatan Indians were, I guess, but there was a time that Croatan must be a Croatan Indian. So race was, he grew up at a time. And, you know, I was thinking, and I thought many times that if he had not passed into white society as a mulatto on the census or a free person of color or whatever, he would not have been admitted to the University of North Carolina. Mm-hmm. After World War II, the walls of segregation were slowly beginning to crumble. 1950 was the year that the first graduate student was admitted here at the university. And Preston was appointed the chairman of the Committee on Race Relations to compose a report as a study guide, quote, for any person who was genuinely concerned of what he or she could do as a Christian in this very important matter. He was going to the Chapel Hill Baptist Church. At the end of the report, and the reports are having a pamphlet, you know, it's 8 pages long. He wrote that he had 2 suggestions, both of them for himself only, unless someone else wanted of his own free will to go and do likewise. And this is what he said, his 2 suggestions. The first suggestion was to try to better understand the fears, ignorance, and prejudice of those that propagate the injustice and unchristian attitudes that are prevalent in race relations. Do they stem from a belief in the other person's racial inferiority? Or perhaps some prejudicial treatment like, quote, man's bonded belief in the inferiority of women is rooted in fear that the other is not inferior, but a full equal who can, if given the chance, prove himself or herself a full equal. The second suggestion was to deal with every person he came into contact with on the basis and assumption that no one is superior or inferior to anyone else through family birth or color. He meant to attribute worth and acceptability only on the basis of conduct in the light of, quote, opportunities and circumstances. That, folks, is pretty enlightened for 1950. I turned 70 this past Monday. I think I'm getting older. I used to think that, and I still do really. I already mentioned thoughts on the Greek that he wrote when he was 82. He also translated at age 76. He translated the Odyssey from Macmillan and Press to be used in high school textbooks. And I came across the transcripts for a series of talks that he gave in 1965. He was 77 years old on WNC TV. The series was entitled Lengthened Perspectives, stating that if our judgments are to be as trustworthy as they can and should be, our perspectives should be lengthened. And there were 6 of these talks. One was on general remarks of the demonic in man. 2, vengeance and its fruits. 3, a sketch of the administration of justice. 4, the pitfall inherent in codes. 5, unavoidable sufferings. And 6, a matrix of the dual nature of man. Now, these were 30 minutes long, and there's just 6 of them. But this was the time, those that remember history or lived through it in the 60s, when Jesse Helms was given editorials on the Capitol Broadcasting Company based in Raleigh. Helms, who later became a United States Senator, referred to the University of North Carolina as the University of Negroes and Communists, and suggested the state should erect a wall around the university so its liberal ideas would not infect the rest of the state. That's lifted from Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms served in the United States Senate for a long time. And but anyhow, while Jesse Helms was speaking these, at least he had these 30-minute TV programs that people could tune into. This he's talking about what I see as a very, I hate to get into labels, but very progressive, forward thinking. He says, he's talking about codes, fixed codes, laws that never, things that never change. And he said this: the idea that any particular code can address an ever-changing society seems an impossible predicament. Both truth and the nature of the world in which we live, 2 wholly autonomous and adamant entities, are dead set against such inflexibility. To prove this point, Epps used a line from religious fundamentalists that said, quote, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. While he agreed with that statement, he added the addendum that man's conception of God has ever been changing and growing, as it must if man is to, quote, escape from religious I'm trying to speak this word, infantilism. Religious infantilism and mature into the responsible religious possibilities he is capable of. Ideas that are seen as changeless, eternal verities, God, justice, mercy, righteousness, creative goodwill, are general subjective terms which need to be interpreted and acted upon. Consequently, even though they may be changeless in nature, interpretations and applications of them are not. My words, the talk clearly showed the liberal minds of Preston Epps positive against some of the conservative political and religious thoughts of the day. People need to look for ways to change, to improve, not just for the sake of change, but to become the best possible individuals and society they and it can become. I have talked, and I'm not going to spend just a few minutes on family. Talk a little bit more about it in the book. This is Preston's second wife, Miriam. His first wife, Stella, died of a massive stroke in 1933 in Greenville, South Carolina. And 2 years later, he married the organist of the First Baptist Church, the assistant dean at Furman University Women's College, and that was my grandmother, Miriam. She was so devoted to him. She was not gonna say a whole lot about her. She was just one. She was a ton of fun to be around, and she was a major part of our lives until her death in 1990. And this is a picture of, that's my brother up front with the goofy look. Yeah, you look a lot better. My grandmother, granddaddy, holding another baby Marge, baby sister, my older sister, and they're all here today. And then mother in the back. So that's just on Rosemary Street. Going to visit was a wonderful, wonderful time. In 1980, granddaddy had a heart attack. His last 2 years were difficult. His heart simply could not keep up with his mind, which remained perfectly sharp right to the end. Never failed him. He'd read the obituaries in the morning. He moaned that everybody gets to die but me. To which Miriam said, "Now, Preston, you know God's got time for everything." And he supposedly groaned and said, "Yeah, but there's only 169 years. I'd hate to wait that long." In July of 1982, he died at his home. The next day, the Chapel Hill Weekly headline, front page, UNC mourns the death of a noble spirit. His funeral was at Binkley Baptist Church. He had left the Chapel Hill, now University Baptist Church, during the integration issues. He went to the community church in Chapel Hill, which is now a Unitarian church. He was there and he did some preaching and officiated services, and I think when they moved out to Glen Lennox in 1970, and Miriam wanted to go to the Baptist Church, Binkley was recently founded. Binkley, where Dean Smith went to church, and of course, I really like that. And of course, they're very progressive in integrating the basketball team and integrating the church too. Many Black parishioners at Binkley, but and Robert Seymour, Reverend Seymour, and I just found out he passed away last year at the age of 95 or 96. I had the blessing to be able to converse with him on the phone about the book, and sent him a copy, and he read the book, and we exchanged a letter to that regard. But he was Reverend Seymour was an amazing man in his own right. But he said this about he actually preached the homily at Preston's funeral. In his homily, Reverend Seymour noted his visits to the Epps home. Quote, "Even in these last years of declining health, he never lost his inquiring mind and often expressed his opinions about current issues of the day. He was convinced that the promise of tomorrow significantly depended upon our heeding the legacy of wisdom left to us by the great teachers of yesterday." He had planned his funeral, written everything out, and at the funeral, one of the hymns there was "Amazing Grace," and so "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound to a believer's ear." I said, "Mom," I said, "I don't think that's the words. I think it's to save the wretch like me." And Mother said, "Well, your grandfather had a way of changing words and hymns that he didn't really like. And he never thought of himself as a wretch." So we sang "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound to a believer's ear" at his funeral. And he wrote on the back of the funeral bulletin, he wrote this: "I leave this wonderful world with a heart overflowing with an everlasting gratitude for it and its creator, and for the countless favors and blessings it has showered on me during my earthly sojourn. Among them are these especially: a devoted and understanding family, treasured and understanding friends and neighbors, helpful colleagues, tolerant of my shortcomings, sympathetic and cooperative students to work with, and a society willing to allow me to devote myself in the fullest possible freedom to trying to pass on to others the best fuller understanding I could muster of an ancient society that has contributed as much as any presently known to the civilizing of Western man. But the thing I have long been most grateful for has been the constant companionship of an unseen friend, ever ready to cooperate with me in all that was honorable and good. Although I have failed him many, many times, never in all the years as he failed me. Kenneth Reckford, actually the classics department put together a 7-page memorial to Preston Epps that was as a resolution, I suppose, to the UNC Senate. But again, Kenneth Reckford, who was the chair of the department at that time, wrote this poem. And again, I found just last year that Professor Reckford had passed away. But this was the poem that he wrote to my grandfather. Well, that's it. Any questions? I went maybe 5 minutes longer than I thought I would. But if there's any questions or comments, yes, ma'am.
In your long memory with him, what is your favorite story about being with him?
Gosh, my favorite story of Granddaddy. I'll let my siblings take that. I know what I wanted to do. You didn't bring it up here. Let me tell them the story about the glasses, opera glasses. You want to tell that story?
Oh,
You forgot to give me the CD. I was going to put a CD. I want to say one other thing, and this may get the stories. One of the amazing stories that he told me that I talk about was that, yeah, he loved to sing. He had what was that, baritone? He was he a baritone? Yeah, he was a baritone. See, I'm not musical at all, but is that the summer before he went to Carolina, somebody in that Second Baptist church, and he never identified, paid for him to go to New York City and take voice lessons from a Mr. Florio. And he'd never been out of North Carolina, Virginia. He went to Norfolk and caught a boat to New York City. And while he was on that boat, these people of Knights of Columbus sort of took to him, and they put him up in this hotel in downtown, which was in walking distance from Mr. Florio's studio. And he took lessons, and there was this wealthy young girl who had lessons right behind him, and she called in sick every day, and she didn't want to go sing, I reckon. But so he ended up getting that extra lessons. He talked about all these times that he called Providence and smiled upon him. You know, he was so lucky and just amazing that he would go. And he ended up going 2 other summers to New York City to take voice lessons. As my sister said, there was always money for music and books in the Epps household. He never owned a home either. He always rented and never owned 2 vehicles in his life. So
Now, from what my mom told me about Preston, her dad, he had a fabulous baritone voice, which my dear niece Kristen put together this CD of Preston Epps songs, which we can maybe play a little bit while we're getting ready to leave. But anyway, he had a beautiful voice, and my mother told me that Preston had told her when he went to New York to study voice, his voice teacher thought he had a fabulous voice and had a lot of potential, but really what kept him from pursuing a career as a singer was he didn't have quite the range that he needed. His voice didn't go high and low enough to do what
he would need it to do to be successful in that world. And so that's, we might have lost all these great treasures that he gave us with his Greek and classics teaching, had he had a bigger range in his board. I guess we can be thankful for that.
Well, I thought that maybe something was played with this, that we didn't find anything to play some of his. And actually, some of these, my daughter-in-law were, she transcribed, I had a cassette place, but she put them on CD. And some of them, the first one, Morgan, was on he sang on his 90th birthday. He gave kind of an impromptu concert to those that were there for that. But anything else? Any other? Yes.
One very quick question. How do you spell Sappony?
Sappony.
Sappony.
Right. And that's
Sappony.
that Sappony. Now,
Saponi.
yeah. Hey, what are you doing?
I just want to tell you all, this is my MHA relative. And if I had any question about my indigenous heritage, I lost it today. I have been all over campus looking for it. I was not gonna let this man come to my county and not find him. I'm so grateful that you're here.
No, I'm so sorry you missed. I'm glad you made it. Anything else? Yes.
I should just introduce myself coming in from the hall right now. Professor Al Duncan in the classics department. My task, my remit here for Courtney was just to say some things about Professor Epps's legacy within the department. And I have some specific verbiage to quote here from our departmental website. Pull it up here because we of course have the Epps Prize in Greek Studies. So this is perhaps the most literal way that Preston Epps's legacy is remembered every year within the department. And the gift is given to that student who said faculty shall judge shows the greatest interest and promise in coming to understand the Greek language, literature, history, and outlook. And it really is a holistic assessment of the students' engagement with Greek. And just looking at the last few winners, these are students coming from a variety of backgrounds, students who are going on to become teachers, or one musical case, a very successful DJ. But these are students who are brought into Greek, not knowing necessarily what it is, finding the passion, finding this to really in ways that resonate so well with your presentation, that spark a fire in them. So it's a wonderful way to honor his legacy with the name. And I think it's important that we remember these names and remember the history. But of course, names are just rose by any other name would be as sweet. It's the legacies of teaching, I think, that is something that has really defined the Carolina Classics department. We still strive, I think, all of us every day, and I see a lot of my colleagues in the department, graduate students as well, to make sure that everyone who comes into Carolina can have the opportunity for a transformative experience through these languages and through the Greek culture. I don't think any of us have the track record nearly that could match Preston Epps's of 5 to 26, 3 to 100, but we try. We try our best, and making sure that everyone who comes in, and I was talking to one of you before the presentation, seeing Latin in the other room and saying, oh, I hated Latin. We don't want anyone feeling that way. So if you know anyone who's hoping to take this language, please send them our way. Last but not least, and I would be I would be remiss if I did not direct you to the donation jar up here as well, and to thank Courtney and Katie for all of the work they've done in putting this event together. Maybe we could give them a round of applause. Hall, but then also on the third floor in the Ullman Library, the classics librarian Ethan has put together a kind of exhibit of some of the off-prints, notes, and publications from Professor Epps. So if there's a long line for the beverages, you might either take the stairs all the way up, or at the end of the hall, there's an elevator. Take that to the third floor. The library is in the center, and it's a little bit of that realia. You can put us in touch with them so much through the presentation, but just to see the handwriting, the books, it's something special. Courtney, I think I should turn this back over to you.
Yeah, I just have to do a few commercial things. Right? So first of all, we just wanted to thank the Department of Classics. We are so honored to be here and grateful to you to allow us to use this space. So, and then, as I mentioned earlier, I am not only the programs coordinator for events like this, but also the exhibits coordinator. And wanted to tell you, if you haven't been yet, you can see our current special exhibit. It's called What's Your Flavor? And it takes a very creative look at heritage cooking. There's also an exhibit. We are collaborating with the Chapel Hill Historical Society, and they have an exhibit about the history of Chapel Hill, part 1. So you got to get in there soon because part 2 is coming very soon. Our permanent exhibit is always there, and it's the history of Orange County. Last thing I wanted to say is our next special exhibit will be coming in February. And we put it out to the county for people to vote on. The winning topic was treasure hunters. And so we are looking right now for collectors. We have until the end of this month to find people. Everybody collects something, consciously or unconsciously. I said, oh, I don't collect anything. And then somebody pointed to my wall where I had all of my playbills from Broadway shows framed. I'm like, I guess I do collect something. So we want to see the interesting things, to learn more about Orange County people and what we are drawn to. So if you do have something that you collect that you'd be willing to share, there are different ways to share it. One is to actually physically have things in the cases, and that will be juried. But we are also putting together posters to hang on the wall that will tell about your collection. Or if you just want to stop in, if you're familiar with, Antiques Roadshow, at the end they have their video booth, and they're like, well, found out that this wasn't worth anything, but every time we're doing a video. So we'd love to get you involved in any way that we can with our treasure hunters exhibit. And if you'd like to purchase books, we have the Hooper book, where you will actually see Preston Epps singing, and we have the biographies here, and you can also sign up to be on our mailing list. So
I always mention that this is November, American Indian Heritage Month, and there's a big celebration going on at the Museum of History in Raleigh on November the 19th. And it says on here, celebrate North Carolina's first people. And I think with the information we have about Dr. Epps, he is the first American Indian to be a student here and to teach here. And so it is wonderful to hear about his legacy and his connection to this university. And I think that all of us should be supportive of getting in touch with the administration here to make sure that it is appropriately recognized, and look forward to a building named after Dr. Epps sometime.
I'd like to invite everybody to come see me because I'm going to be there representing our Sappony tribe. I've been there for this will be my 22nd year. During virtual for a couple of years, but we're going to be back in person. And I'll be down there on the first floor with the quilt and the Sappony and the Three Sisters. So just come see me, visit me, and say, do you remember me? And I'll say, no. But please stop by and say that, and say hi to me while you're there.
Thank you, Sheila.
Just one thing? Okay. I'm sorry, but the term mulatto was used to do as a degrading, extremely, and my mama, if you wanted to see her fly mad, if you want to get cut, said that to her and called her that.
She might not get close enough to you to cut you, but she'll throw a rock at you. Because that was used. And so when you've been identified as something that would hurt you, I can see why Mr. Preston Epps didn't reconnect as much as he could with our tribe, because that happened a lot. Some people were so hurt that they never came back, and they didn't stay in contact with us, but most people didn't have phones.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, the not coming back when the diaspora, because to come back would then be to identify in a time in which that would be very harmful. Of course, my granddad was only 11 or 12 years old, so I really, that's a question. How much he knew is something I'll never know, and I'll often wonder. But what I think even would be more important is when I see things that he wrote and said in his life to show that who you are is who you become, not what not whether you're black or white or Sappony or whatever, is what you make of your life. And he shows that time and time again in his writings. Does anybody
Can I just say,
yeah.
As an English that we have in the hegemony of our language hundreds of expressions to tell somebody that they're not white, and that is where that problem starts. Quadroons, mulattoes, all sorts of words, and they all mean not white. But I would just like to very much thank you for teaching me so much about this man. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Does anybody in the room, other than my siblings, that knew Preston Epps? I'm just curious. I mean, it's been so long ago. Okay.
No, and in that, obituary you mentioned, or that in the Chapel Hill Weekly, they said everybody in Chapel Hill knew him, at the time he died, and that was only 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Thank you all so much for joining us.